After 20 years of working at the same company, I never imagined my life would change so quickly. I walked into the office that morning like any other day, ready to start my tasks, check emails, and help my team finish a big project. I had spent 2 decades learning every process, training new employees, and making sure everything ran smoothly. I was proud of my work and trusted that my loyalty and effort meant something. That's why what happened next hit me like a truck. Richard Connors, my boss, called me into his office. I thought it was about the promotion he had promised months ago. I thought maybe it was recognition for the late nights and weekends I had given to the company. But instead, he handed me a letter and said I was being let go. There were no warnings, no discussion about performance, nothing. Just a simple paper that ended everything I had worked for. I stood there frozen, staring at him. I couldn't understand it. My hands were shaking, my heart racing. Colleagues outside his office peeked in, their faces full of confusion and pity. The humiliation burned worse than the shock. After all these years, I had expected respect, maybe a thank you, but not this. I had given this company everything, my time, my energy, my loyalty, and it didn't matter. I walked back to my desk, trying to keep my composure, but the office felt different now. Every corner, every familiar sound reminded me of the life I had built there. I felt invisible, betrayed, and powerless all at once. The people I had mentored, the projects I had saved, the late nights and early mornings, they seemed meaningless now. I went home that evening in silence. Laura, my wife, noticed something was wrong the moment I walked in. I told her everything, trying to hold back tears, but the betrayal felt too heavy to keep inside. She held me while I talked, reminding me that being treated unfairly didn't define my worth. Her words were a small comfort, but the anger was already starting to grow inside me. I couldn't stop thinking about Richard. How could he throw me away after 20 years? How could he not see my loyalty, my effort, my heart in that office every single day? The more I thought about it, the more the anger and disbelief turned into determination. I wasn't going to let this betrayal define me. I wasn't going to let Richard walk away thinking he could destroy someone who had given everything to the company. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to react blindly, and I wasn't going to lash out. But I would find a way to make him see that loyalty and integrity cannot be ignored forever. Something had shifted in me. I felt a spark, a quiet resolve that this story wasn't over, and it wouldn't end the way he expected. I went to bed that night with my mind racing, a mix of hurt and determination. The betrayal was real, the humiliation sharp, but I knew one thing, I would not be broken. This was only the beginning. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying every conversation I'd had with Richard over the past months, even years. Was there a hint I missed? A subtle change in tone or a glance that meant trouble? I went through every meeting, every project update, and every promise he had made. Nothing had seemed out of place at the time, and yet here I was, blindsided. The doubt gnawed at me, mixing with the anger I already felt. Laura noticed my restlessness and sat beside me on the couch. She didn't ask too many questions at first, she knew I needed to process this myself, but she held my hand and gave me a steady presence. "You're stronger than this, Daniel," she said quietly. "You've given your best for years. Don't let one person make you feel worthless." Her words were soft but firm, and they gave me a little clarity in the chaos of my thoughts. I realized she was right, I couldn't let Richard's betrayal define me. The next morning, I went back into the office, but with a different perspective. I started paying closer attention, noticing the little things I had overlooked before. How Richard gave certain employees easier tasks, praised others unfairly, or shifted blame when things went wrong. It wasn't just incompetence or poor management, it was favoritism and manipulation. I realized that my promotion had probably been promised to someone else long before he even called me into that office. I began quietly gathering evidence. I kept records of emails, project notes, and discrepancies in Richard's management decisions. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing, not even Laura, because I knew it had to be handled carefully. If I acted too openly, he might destroy the proof or make things worse for me and the people I cared about. I spent hours after work compiling small pieces that, when put together, could show a pattern of unfair practices and unethical behavior. Even as I worked on this, the heartbreak was real. I had trusted Richard for decades, and I had genuinely believed in him. To think that he could throw me aside without a second thought was painful in ways I hadn't expected. The sense of betrayal wasn't just professional, it felt personal. I had invested not only time but my respect and loyalty, and now it seemed like he didn't value any of it. Yet, beneath the hurt, a determination began to grow. If he thought he could treat me this way and walk away unscathed, he was wrong. I would make sure the truth came to light, not through gossip or rage, but through facts and evidence. I wanted him to see that his actions had consequences. More than that, I wanted to reclaim my sense of control and dignity. By the end of that week, the pieces were starting to fall into place. I felt a cautious sense of hope mixed with the lingering doubt, hope that I could turn this betrayal into justice, and doubt that the path ahead would be simple. But one thing was clear, I wouldn't let Richard's selfishness destroy me. I would find a way to stand up, and when I did, he wouldn't see it coming. The next morning, I walked into the office with a heavy heart, but a new thought kept gnawing at me. If I just walked away quietly, Richard would win. He would think he could treat loyal people however he wanted and face no consequences. That idea made my blood boil. I realized I couldn't let that happen, not after everything I had given to the company. I began thinking carefully about how I could turn the tables without putting myself at risk. I knew the office inside out, how projects were managed, who handled what, where mistakes were often covered up. I had seen patterns in Richard's behavior for years. If I moved carefully, I could use that knowledge to expose his unfair practices and make sure he couldn't hide behind his title. The moral struggle was real. I kept asking myself if I was becoming the kind of person I had always despised, someone acting out of anger. But each time I remembered the humiliation and betrayal, the anger grew stronger. It wasn't about revenge for revenge's sake, it was about justice. It was about proving that loyalty, integrity, and hard work mattered more than favoritism and selfishness. One afternoon, while passing Richard's office to deliver a document, I overheard him speaking to one of his favorite employees. He laughed and said, "Getting rid of the weak link was easier than I thought. No one will question me." Those words hit me like a punch. He had no idea I had been listening. No one saw the hurt in me, the fire that had just been ignited. In that moment, the path became clear. I wouldn't act recklessly, but I would act intelligently. I started quietly mapping out how I could reveal his mistakes and favoritism without drawing attention to myself. I reviewed old reports and emails in my mind, remembering every error he had tried to cover up, every employee he had overlooked, every decision that had been unfair. Each piece of knowledge became a tool. Each memory of his arrogance added fuel to the plan forming in my mind. The more I thought about it, the more focused I became. I didn't need to confront him head-on. I didn't need to yell or make a scene. What mattered was that the truth would come out, carefully, silently, and in a way he couldn't ignore. That was the kind of revenge that mattered, the one that didn't make me stoop to his level but still ensured he faced the consequences of his actions. By the end of the day, I felt a strange sense of calm mixed with anticipation. The anger was still there, sharp and powerful, but now it had direction. I had a plan forming, and with patience and careful steps, I could make sure Richard realized that loyalty and honesty could not be crushed. The seed of revenge had been planted, and I would watch it grow carefully until the right moment came. Over the next few days, I realized I couldn't do this alone. Richard's power was too strong, and his control over the office made it easy for him to cover up mistakes and favoritism. I needed allies, people who understood what it felt like to be overlooked, undervalued, or mistreated. Quietly, I started reaching out to colleagues I trusted, the ones I knew had suffered under Richard's unfair leadership. Emma was the first person I spoke to. She had been with the company for nearly a decade, always working hard, always giving her best, but Richard never acknowledged her efforts. Her ideas were often dismissed, and promotions passed her by. When I explained my thoughts and showed her some examples of Richard's manipulations, she didn't hesitate to help. Her anger matched mine, but she was level-headed and careful, which made her perfect for the plan. Kevin was another colleague I approached. He was new enough to the company to still be underestimated, but sharp and observant. He had noticed discrepancies in Richard's decisions and had quietly kept notes over the years. When I asked if he would join me, he nodded without question. He understood that we weren't just acting out of revenge, we were aiming to bring the truth to light. Together, we started putting pieces of Richard's corruption and favoritism into order. I knew the internal systems better than anyone. I had spent years managing projects, tracking reports, and understanding every process in the office. Using that knowledge, we began quietly gathering proof, emails, project notes, records of mismanaged funds, and examples of Richard taking credit for others' work. We had to be careful. One wrong move, and everything could fall apart. As we worked together, a sense of justice started to grow. It wasn't just about getting back at Richard anymore. It was about exposing the truth and showing that hard work, honesty, and integrity could not be ignored. Every time we found another piece of evidence, every time we connected the dots, I felt a small relief. It was like we were building a foundation, not just for revenge, but for fairness and accountability. The office had always been a place of stress and quiet frustration under Richard's rule. Now, with Emma and Kevin at my side, it felt different. There was energy in our small alliance, a quiet excitement that we were doing something meaningful. The betrayal I had felt began to transform into purpose. I could feel the catharsis starting, the satisfaction of knowing that patience, careful planning, and teamwork could tip the scales. Richard had underestimated all of us. He thought loyalty was a weakness, but together, we were proving that the very people he dismissed were capable of change, of exposing his manipulation, and of reclaiming what he had tried to take from us. By the end of the week, our small group was ready to act. We had everything we needed to reveal the truth carefully and decisively. The sense of power and justice building inside me was unlike anything I had felt before. We weren't just plotting revenge, we were creating accountability, and for the first time since the firing, I felt hope. Once we had enough evidence, I decided it was time to take the first steps, but carefully. I couldn't let Richard know it was me. I began sending anonymous reports to HR and some members of the board, highlighting specific examples of his misconduct, how he took credit for others' work, manipulated projects to favor certain employees, and ignored clear mismanagement. Each report was factual, precise, and undeniable. At first, nothing seemed to happen. I stayed patient, knowing change rarely came overnight. But then, small signs began to appear. Richard started acting differently. He called extra meetings, double-checked every report, and questioned decisions that normally would have gone unnoticed. His usually confident demeanor showed cracks. I could see his paranoia growing, even from across the office. He was used to being in complete control, but suddenly, the stability he relied on was slipping. Colleagues began whispering quietly. Some exchanged glances during meetings. There was tension in the air that hadn't been there before. People started asking questions. Why was Richard acting so nervous? Why were minor errors being examined so closely? No one suspected me, but I could feel the energy shifting. The office that had once been dominated by fear and favoritism was now filled with uncertainty for Richard. Even though I felt satisfaction every time I noticed his unease, I kept my identity hidden. I didn't want to rush or make mistakes. Every move had to be calculated. The more he struggled to maintain control, the more patient I remained. Each small victory reinforced the plan and reminded me that this wasn't about revenge in the traditional sense, it was about exposing the truth and seeing justice quietly unfold. Emma and Kevin were careful too, watching Richard's reactions and helping to confirm that our reports were having an effect. We kept communicating in whispers, in safe corners, making sure nothing connected back to us. The satisfaction of seeing our efforts slowly weaken his grip was intoxicating, but we all knew it had to be done correctly. Every day brought a new little crack in Richard's confidence. He micromanaged more than ever, grew short-tempered, and sometimes snapped at employees for no reason. The office had never felt so tense. People were cautious but curious, sensing that something was happening behind the scenes. And I, quietly watching it all, felt a strange mix of satisfaction and anticipation. By the end of that week, I knew the next stage had to come. The groundwork was laid, the pieces were moving in our favor, and Richard's paranoia had reached a point where he was making mistakes he couldn't hide. Every whispered comment, every hesitant glance, every small misstep he made reinforced that our patience and careful planning were working. I reminded myself to stay calm and disciplined. The small wins were proof that the plan was unfolding perfectly, but the ultimate goal, complete exposure and justice, was still ahead. With every step, I felt more confident that the moment we revealed the full truth, it would be undeniable, and Richard would finally see that loyalty, integrity, and patience could never be ignored. A few days later, things got tense. Richard had clearly noticed the disruption in his control and had started looking for the person responsible. He called employees into his office, asking questions, checking emails, and demanding explanations for every small error or delay. The paranoia in his eyes was obvious, and I knew it was only a matter of time before he tried to catch the leaker. One afternoon, I almost got caught. I was reviewing some old project files in a quiet corner of the office when Richard unexpectedly walked past, glancing sharply at my laptop screen. My heart raced. I quickly minimized the documents, but the brief look on his face told me he was suspicious. I felt a cold panic run through me. Every second stretched like hours. If he had noticed even a hint, everything we had worked for could have collapsed in an instant. I spent the rest of the day carefully monitoring my movements. My hands shook more than usual, and I could feel doubt creeping in. What if he found out? What if all the planning, the patience, the careful steps, were wasted because of one small mistake? My mind raced through worst-case scenarios, and for the first time, I felt fear that went beyond anger or determination. That evening, I came home exhausted and tense. Laura noticed immediately. I couldn't even sit down before I started telling her about the close call. She listened quietly, then held my hands and looked me in the eyes. "Daniel," she said softly, "don't let fear control you. Remember, this isn't just about revenge. It's about justice. You're not trying to hurt him for the sake of it, you're making sure the truth comes out. Stay careful, stay smart, and stay focused." Her voice calmed me in a way that nothing else could. Her words reminded me why I had started this in the first place. It wasn't about satisfying anger, it was about exposing wrongdoing and protecting the people Richard had undermined for years. I realized that fear was natural, but it couldn't stop me. In fact, it made me more cautious and precise, sharpening every decision I made. The next day, I returned to the office with a mix of tension and exhilaration. Knowing that I had narrowly avoided exposure made every step feel more intense. Each glance at Richard's office, each whispered conversation among colleagues, each subtle reaction became part of the game. I was acutely aware of the stakes, and it made every small success feel even more satisfying. Even with the stress and doubt, I felt a growing sense of resolve. The risk reminded me that what I was doing mattered. The fear of being caught and the thrill of staying one step ahead created a powerful combination. I knew I had to continue carefully, but it also reminded me that the end result, justice and the truth coming out, would be worth every moment of stress. By the time I left the office that evening, my mind was focused and alert. The close call had shown me how fragile our plan could be, but it had also strengthened my determination. I understood that patience, caution, and focus were now more important than ever, and that every move I made could bring us closer to the outcome we had been working for. A few weeks later, the tension in the office reached a new level. I started noticing subtle changes. HR and board members were asking unusual questions, requesting reports, and reviewing projects that had never been questioned before. The anonymous reports we had sent were working. Richard had no idea who was behind them, but he could feel the pressure mounting. He began lashing out at employees, trying to find someone to blame. Meetings became chaotic. He criticized work that was previously praised, questioned decisions with unreasonable intensity, and snapped at people for mistakes that weren't theirs. The office was on edge, and I could see fear and confusion in the eyes of colleagues. Richard was trying to maintain control, but his grip was slipping. I watched all of this quietly, careful not to draw attention. Each outburst, each frantic decision, confirmed that our plan was working. The board was digging deeper, uncovering inconsistencies and mismanagement. Richard's arrogance, which had once seemed untouchable, was starting to crumble under scrutiny. He had no idea that the person he had dismissed, the one he thought was powerless, was the one quietly guiding the truth to the right people. The tension was palpable. Colleagues whispered in corners, sharing theories about what was happening. Some tried to stay out of the way, others watched with growing curiosity. Richard's behavior had made the office unpredictable, and the uncertainty added to the suspense. No one could say how far the investigation would go or what would be discovered next. Every time Richard lashed out or mismanaged a situation, I felt a mix of satisfaction and anticipation. The months of careful planning, gathering evidence, and staying patient were paying off. He was making mistakes that he couldn't cover up, and each one brought us closer to the full exposure of his misconduct. Yet, I stayed cautious. Even with the board involved, nothing was certain until the evidence had been fully reviewed and the truth became undeniable. One wrong move could tip the balance or allow him to deflect blame. I reminded myself to remain patient, keep my identity hidden, and let the process unfold naturally. There were moments when I almost couldn't believe it, watching someone so confident, so commanding, struggle and falter in front of everyone. Richard had built a facade of control and power over decades, and now it was breaking apart piece by piece. The office, once silent under his authority, was filled with tension, whispers, and the quiet anticipation of change. By the end of the week, it was clear that Richard's downfall had begun. The investigation was serious, the board was asking tough questions, and his own employees were no longer intimidated. He was reacting out of fear rather than authority, and I could see the cracks spreading in every interaction. Sitting quietly at my desk, I felt a surge of satisfaction, tempered by caution. The tension, the uncertainty, and the slow unraveling of Richard's control made everything feel more real, more urgent, and more satisfying. The plan was working, and the moment of full justice was approaching, so close that I could almost see it on the horizon. The day finally came when everything we had been working toward could no longer be ignored. I carefully compiled all the evidence, emails, reports, project notes, and records of Richard's favoritism and mismanagement, into a clear, undeniable package. I requested a meeting with the board and presented the proof in a calm, factual way. I didn't raise my voice or let emotion take over, I let the evidence speak for itself. The board members listened intently, reviewing documents and asking precise questions. Each piece I presented made it harder for them to deny the truth. I showed how Richard had misused company funds, manipulated promotions to favor certain employees, and dismissed or humiliated those who had given their best. The weight of his betrayal became undeniable in that room. Richard was called into the meeting to respond, but he quickly realized he couldn't defend himself. His usual confidence faltered as the board presented each piece of evidence. I could see the color drain from his face. Colleagues who had once watched helplessly were now staring in disbelief, seeing a side of him they had only suspected before. The arrogance and control he had relied on for years were gone. The humiliation was clear. Richard's attempts to justify his actions failed completely. His explanations were weak, contradictory, and unconvincing. Every word he tried to say only made the evidence stronger. The board's questions became sharper, their expressions serious, and it was obvious that the consequences he had worked so hard to avoid were now unavoidable. Even though the moment was tense, I felt a sense of calm satisfaction. Patience and careful planning had brought us here. All the months of quietly gathering evidence, staying anonymous, and building a strong case had paid off. I didn't need to yell or attack him personally. The truth alone was enough to reveal the betrayal and restore justice. The office staff, both in the room and those who later heard about it, were stunned. Many felt relief that someone had finally stood up for the employees who had been overlooked and mistreated. I could see that this wasn't just about punishing Richard, it was about protecting others and showing that integrity and honesty mattered. There was a quiet lesson in all of this. Revenge isn't just about anger or satisfying hurt feelings. True justice comes from exposing wrongdoing, ensuring fairness, and standing up for those who cannot stand up for themselves. I had been hurt and betrayed, but the plan wasn't about me alone, it was about creating accountability and making sure the system worked as it should. By the end of the meeting, Richard was left with no power and no excuses. The weight of his actions rested on him entirely, and I walked out knowing that the truth had been revealed. It was a quiet but complete victory. Watching his facade crumble, seeing justice served without malice or chaos, was a moment of relief and satisfaction that I would never forget. The betrayal had been exposed, and the office could finally start to heal. After the board's investigation, the company approached me with an offer I never expected. They wanted me back in a high-ranking position, acknowledging my dedication and the value I had always brought. On paper, it seemed like a victory, but I realized that returning would mean stepping back into the same environment that had allowed Richard's behavior to go unchecked for so long. I didn't want that. I didn't want to be part of a system that rewarded loyalty only after betrayal. Instead, I chose a different path. With the support of Laura and a few trusted colleagues, I decided to start my own consultancy. It was a fresh start, a chance to build something on my own terms, free from toxic leadership and favoritism. I could create a space where integrity mattered, where hard work and honesty were recognized, and where people could thrive without fear of being undermined. The transition wasn't easy, but it was empowering. Laura was by my side every step of the way, offering encouragement and helping me plan the next chapter of my career. Emma and Kevin joined me as partners, bringing their skills and loyalty into a team built on trust. Together, we began to build a consultancy that reflected the values we had always believed in, and for the first time in years, I felt excitement instead of tension when I thought about work. Back at the office, the staff quietly celebrated the outcome. They respected me not because of revenge, but because of the integrity I had shown throughout the process. People who had once felt powerless under Richard's control were now inspired. They saw that patience, careful planning, and commitment to truth could overcome manipulation and corruption. The quiet nods of respect, the small congratulations in passing, and the smiles from colleagues reminded me that loyalty and hard work still mattered. As I settled into my new role, I felt a sense of dignity and closure that I hadn't realized I was missing. The betrayal I had endured had been painful, but it had also led to growth and clarity. I was no longer defined by what Richard had done to me. Instead, I was defined by how I responded, by choosing justice over bitterness, action over despair, and integrity over anger. Life began to feel lighter. Laura and I could enjoy simple moments together again, dinners without stress, quiet weekends, and planning for the future. I felt proud of the life we were building, proud of the team I had assembled, and proud that we were creating something meaningful from the pain of the past. The sense of triumph was subtle but powerful. It wasn't about making Richard suffer, it was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, and my values. For the first time in years, I felt completely in control of my path, confident in my choices, and free to grow. The betrayal had ended, the truth had been revealed, and I had emerged stronger, wiser, and finally at peace. Sitting at my kitchen table one morning, holding a warm cup of coffee, I finally allowed myself to take a deep breath and reflect on everything that had happened. The last few months had been a whirlwind of betrayal, careful planning, and quiet battles fought behind the scenes. I remembered the shock of being fired, the humiliation, the anger that had burned inside me, and the sleepless nights spent figuring out the next steps. It hadn't been easy, but every moment had taught me something important. I thought about Richard and how his arrogance had blinded him. He had underestimated loyalty, patience, and the quiet strength of people who refused to be dismissed. Watching him struggle, seeing the truth come to light, and knowing that justice had been served without me stooping to anger felt more powerful than I could have imagined. I realized then that revenge wasn't about hurting him, it was about reclaiming what was mine, my dignity, my integrity, and my life. The journey had been as much about self-discovery as it was about exposing wrongdoing. I had learned patience, careful observation, and the power of strategic thinking. I had rebuilt relationships with colleagues like Emma and Kevin, and strengthened the bond with Laura, who had been my constant support. Their encouragement reminded me that success isn't just measured by outcomes but by how you handle challenges and maintain your principles along the way. Sipping my coffee, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. I no longer carried the weight of anger or fear. The office politics, the favoritism, and Richard's betrayal no longer had power over me. I was free to focus on building my consultancy, supporting my team, and living a life defined by my own choices rather than the whims of a toxic leader. Each day now began with calm confidence instead of stress or worry. I also reflected on the lessons I wanted others to understand. Loyalty, hard work, and patience are not weaknesses. They are strengths that, when combined with careful thought and integrity, can overcome arrogance and deceit. Justice doesn't always come instantly, but if you stay true to your values and act wisely, the truth will prevail. It's not about revenge for revenge's sake, it's about standing up, protecting yourself and others, and showing that ethical choices matter. Looking out the window at the quiet morning, I felt gratitude. Gratitude for the people who supported me, for the strength I didn't know I had, and for the chance to create something meaningful on my own terms. The past could no longer hurt me, and the future was mine to shape. For the first time in a long time, I felt completely at peace. I hadn't just survived betrayal, I had grown stronger, reclaimed my life, and proved that patience, loyalty, and integrity could outlast arrogance. Sitting there with my coffee, watching the sunlight filter through the window, I knew that this was more than an ending. It was a beginning.